We're at the point now where conversations are being had between Russia, the United States, as well as Ukraine and the United States. But it seems that one of the strategic parts about Russia's strategy is essentially leveraging the West's desire to avoid confrontation. And it seems that that's been what's happening recently. So, what do you make of that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And a lot of people don't talk about that. But I think, Russia always tries to play the card that if you do this, World War III will start. And it is a legitimate concern. I mean, we do have to say nuclear weapons are serious, and both the United States and Russia have, thousands of them. So it's not an idiotic concept. But the problem is that I think that, and if you go back to like the Biden administration, they legitimately took this into consideration, but they held back from doing certain things, feeling that, Russia would take it as an assault and begin a war. And I actually don't believe that Putin thinks that the United States is going to threaten them with a war or start a war, or even that NATO would. I mean, they talk about this, but I don't think in reality, although there is at this point a lot of paranoia, and I'd have to say more paranoia than I've ever seen. But I still don't think in the real world that they think NATO is going to bomb Moscow.
President Trump has had this off and on criticism of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. I just wonder what you make of these comments and how it also factors into U.S. Russia relations, because it seems the U.S. is getting pulled toward Russia and away from Ukraine in that sense.
True, but I mean, Jaden, let's look at the past few weeks. I mean, it's been this direction, that direction. Putin is good, Putin is bad, Putin wants a war. No, he doesn't want a war. So it's very hard to keep that up. And today, now, I mean, again, we shouldn't even say today because things change, but the Russians actually hit a factory that is at least partially owned by the Americans. And that kind of astounded me until, of course, I think it's on the border with Hungary. I started thinking, sometimes their precise so-called weapons don't hit exactly what they wanted to hit. So I'm not convinced in the middle of negotiations, they would attack an American factory. It just does not make sense. But getting back, to your question, I think if you're talking about Putin's view of Zelensky, is I think essentially your
Yeah.
question. I mean, look, there is a lot of animosity. I think that they have disdain and probably hatred for each other. You can see why Zelensky would hate Putin because Putin is destroying his country. But the opposite is, I think, if you look at Putin and the way he looks at Zelensky, he would say, this is an illegitimate leader of an illegitimate country. Now, if we break that down, we know that Russia has been saying, Ukraine isn't really a country. It actually was part of Russia and always has been, going back to ancient Rus. And besides, then they get kind of legalistic where they say, and besides, Zelensky is not the legitimate president because, as I'm sure you know, and some of our listeners may know, the presidential term for a Ukrainian president is 5 years. And Zelensky was legally elected, 5 years ago, but 5 years ago expired last year. So he has been in office for 1 year longer than he should be. Now, the reason he would say, and the Ukrainians would say, is that they are in the midst of a war, and you can't have an election in the middle of a war.
Right.
Therefore, he continues, but eventually there will be an election. But the Russians interpret that as Zelensky is completely illegitimate.
And let's zero in on legitimacy for a second, because President Putin has not yet met with President Zelensky. Is that just because he doesn't want to legitimize Zelensky, or is it that he doesn't want any progress to really be accomplished, or is it both?
I think it's both, because if you look at what he has said and what the Russian media say and what the foreign ministry says, they certainly do not consider Zelensky on the level of President Putin. So the idea that President Putin would sit down with President Zelensky is pretty far afield, I think, at this point. So, and then also it would raise questions, I think, for Putin domestically to be seen sitting down with Zelensky, just, politically, would be kind of an embarrassing thing. It would be an acknowledgement that, hey, well, maybe he is the president of Ukraine. So I don't think they can really go there. But that said, I do not want to eliminate the, who knows, 10, 20% possibility that that could happen because, Putin is trying to play cards like Trump is playing cards, yes, no, maybe so. And I think Putin is doing a lot of that too. And occasionally, Putin has done unexpected things. And it could be that just at one moment he would say, I will deign to sit down with Zelensky. At this point, it doesn't seem likely. If I had any money, I don't think I'd put it on, my bet at this point, but it's not entirely impossible.
And I think the politicking that goes on domestically in Russia is something that's easily overlooked because people have to remember at the end of the day, despite the fact that Russia's election results are questionable, there are still people in Russia who have thoughts about this war. And it's really hard to get an accurate read on their interpretations of this war because there's not really access to quality information about
Yeah.
this war. And so, how much time does Putin have left to continue this war before there is that impatience? Because based on the information that is provided to citizens, it's that Russia is doing a great job and being very successful on the battlefield when it's more nuanced.
Yeah, and certainly people know that that a lot of men are dying. There's no question. And in fact, there has been the Russian government has been kind of cracking down on internet connections very recently, within the last few days. And some of that is believed to be because of everything that's going on in Ukraine and the attempt to keep the Russian people from knowing what's going on. But I would say, the idea that I think we had 3.5 years ago was that, oh my goodness, look, they're losing so many people. The Russian people would just say, wow, this is too much. But if you analyze who are the Russian people and who's fighting and who's dying, it does, and you use the word nuanced, it really does get nuanced because it's not the well-off kids who are living in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's essentially people from ethnic areas in Russia who are poor and who can use the inducements that they have to fight. For instance, there has been an offer on the table for quite a while for people if they sign up. It's like a signing bonus for people to sign up to fight. And it was $20,000. Now I understand it's going down, but that's still a lot of money in Russia. So I guess what I'm saying is the people who are paying the price for this with their lives are not necessarily the people who are politically active and saying, we can't take this anymore. That would be more, I think, a big city phenomenon, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other big cities who would just say, no way, but their kids aren't dying. And so the pushback against Putin that we might have expected in a more open society is not happening. And then also one other thing, Jared, I think there's a big factor of propaganda, state propaganda. If you turn on TV, a lot of this is glorification of dying for the fatherland. Even the Russian Orthodox Church at this point, which is pretty much in Moscow, at least controlled by the government, they're saying, it is a glory to die for the fatherland. And so, people say, well, I don't like this, but, I guess Putin knows what he's doing and will support the war.
Yeah, there's so much confidence placed in how Putin views this conflict rather than just what individuals think about this conflict. I do want to talk a little bit about the economics of this war because there's been a lot of speculation about the fact that this war may not be sustainable for Russia's economy. Is there some truth to that, or could Russia's economy actually be driven by war?
Well, I would almost say both, because, all right, it is complicated, but you would say 3.5 years afterwards, how did they survive all the sanctions and all of that? Now, there are a lot of ways they can get around sanctions, but I think you'd have to say that they had, and they still have, a chairman of the central bank, a woman, Nabiulina, who is very smart and who has been able to craft a way to deal with the economic situation as well as anyone ever could. And so she and her team have really rescued Russia over this 3.5 years. So the bad things that could have happened did not happen, at least to the extent that we might have expected. Now, how long can they go on? It's hard to say. They do get help from China, and it's a form of sanctions busting, but it's kind of indirect sanctions busting. They get high-tech equipment from China. They're getting from North Korea, they're getting armaments, as we know, ammunition, etc. So there are predictions that they could probably get through the next year to maybe even 2 years without a lot of difficulty. But that's contingent on whether the sanctions that the United States and the Europeans are talking about aren't used, or maybe are used, but not to the full extent. So if you take like the sanctions that Trump is talking about now, so-called secondary sanctions, those would be on countries, and I know you know this, but it's good to kind of put it out there. Secondary sanctions would be serious. Those would be against countries like China, India, especially, who buy Russian oil.
Right.
Now, so Trump has already put the sanctions 50% on India because they're a big supplier, to punish them for that. But he hasn't touched China. And, you could argue that going against or punishing India was more part of his overall strategy on sanctions than it was about Russia. So that's a long way of saying that Russia could survive for a while. But there are other ways I think that we should be aware of, and you probably know these, but just in case. Right now, you have a country in Russia that has become completely militarized. The economy is militarized, societally, they're militarized, just every way that you can look at it. I mean, little kids are dressing up in uniform, military uniforms, and pretending they're in World War II. So it is really militarized. But the thing that works in Putin's favor is that at the end of the Soviet Union, when everything kind of collapsed and the economy was a mess, a lot of factories that used to produce armaments and manufacturing in general went kaput, closed down. People didn't have jobs. Now, with the wartime economy, those factories are cranking away, and people have jobs, and they're making money, and they're able to put food on the table. And so, even if some Russians would say, again, I don't like the war, I don't like people dying, but I have a job, and I've got cash, and my kids are going to be okay for a while. So that's another factor that I don't think is talked about that much, but it plays in Putin's favor. So yes, there could be crushing sanctions that would really hurt Russia. However, they're not being implemented by the Trump administration to the degree that they've been talking about. And then there are other ways that the Russians can get around this and survive.
Yeah, and when you mention the wartime employment and then the companies that are going to be profiting, that really can be a morale boost. And as you mentioned, the way that this is taken hold in culture, because you have people that are really experiencing this sudden patriotism, which can really affect public opinion about the war. So it's really all linked together in some way. I also want to talk about the negotiations because when economic pain does eventually start to become a part of life, there may be more willingness to negotiate. But what we've heard from Russia, obviously, is no NATO presence in Ukraine. And then the second thing was capping the size of Ukraine's military. For what other reason would the Kremlin demand those things but to invade Ukraine again in the future?
Well, I think that there's no question that they want to take over Ukraine. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have another invasion. There are other ways that you can take over countries. You can undermine, you can change the political leadership, which is one thing that I think Putin definitely has in mind.
For
Make
sure.
things really, really hard politically for Zelensky so that if they hold elections, he goes down. And then they try to engineer a Russia-friendly leader who will take over and then control the country that way. So there are different ways that they can do this, I think, at this point. There's no question. Um, well, maybe you have more questions, but I mean, I think that's a really, really good question.
And it's fascinating because we do see those Russia friendly nations that Russia obviously doesn't mess with. They leave those countries alone because Russia is comfortable with them. Obviously, when you think about Hungary and you think about Georgia, there are similar cases there. I just wonder, what are your expectations for how the U.S. is going to approach negotiations? I know there's conversations about potentially a Zelensky Putin meeting, but the Kremlin laid out a lot of conditions that aren't exactly being met just yet.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems right now is that there's really a lack of clarity in terms of what President Trump actually wants. Specifically, what does he want? We know he wants a peace agreement, but what is actually the policy? What's the approach? What's the strategy? How do you work that out? And you're right now, it does not look as if even at this point, we don't know whether there will be a sit down with Putin and Zelensky, let alone Putin, Zelensky, Trump. So I think it's going to be very difficult until the United States decides on something specific. You can't, like, for domestic consumption here in the United States, President Trump can say, I'm the peacemaker, I want peace. And most people who are sitting at home will say, oh, okay, he wants peace. But they won't know how difficult it is to make peace. Like, what do you really have to do? Give you an example. But what do you do with the people who are living in the areas that Russia wants that it doesn't own, that it hasn't, I should not even say own, that it hasn't conquered? What do you do with them? That could mean hundreds of thousands of people being forced out of their homes because they won't want to live under the Russians. So I think clarity is really, really important. And until we get that, I don't see that there would be much of an opportunity to really have a lasting peace. But you can bet that the Russians know precisely what they want because Putin has been saying the same thing for 3.5 years. His demands are very clear and he hasn't budged at all. And another factor that is really important to me is that domestically here, as the Trump administration has cut back on public servants, meaning people who are at the State Department is void of, it has almost no experts in Russia at this point. Obviously, it has some, but many of the people who really know things many of them have retired or are being pushed out. And so to really understand where Russia is going with this, to psych them out, to understand where they're coming from, I don't think that the Trump administration, sadly, really has a team that is capable of doing that. I mean, none of them apparently even speak Russian or Ukrainian. And, as we saw, Mr. Witkoff was relying on a Russian translator several
Yeah.
times. So I think they're at a disadvantage. And the Russian team, I've covered Lavrov, the foreign minister, for years, decades. And he is he's kind of a difficult guy in many ways, but he's very smart and he knows what he's doing and he has eons of experience. And he's also crafty. So we are hurting ourselves by not having the team that can really pull this out. You can't just have photo ops with Putin. He likes photo ops, but he doesn't really work that way. He wants what he wants.
And I think that it's noticeable to Europe because you're seeing Europe start to take a bigger role in this conflict. We had multiple European leaders at the White House this week, and Germany's chancellor even mentioned that we want a ceasefire first because the president shifted the goalpost to ending the war entirely.
Yeah, yes. And who knows where we will go again. But I mean, that was a huge concession because they went in, they gave him a pep talk, before he went to Alaska. And everyone seemed to be on the same page, ceasefire, then full-scale peace. Putin was the reverse. Putin was saying, no, 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 no ceasefire. We need to have the whole thing. We need to have a whole, root causes, uh, which is his phrase for no NATO, no way, but be settled before we can go to a ceasefire. And just, for the record, doing that, you could, if you trusted Russia, you, of course, could go to a ceasefire, I mean, to a peace agreement very quickly. But right now, the Russians will use that to continue to do what they are doing as of today, another historically huge, vicious bombing.
And it seems that these attacks get worse and worse and worse as these talks continue. There are some signals that are being sent based on these attacks and just how many of them we're starting to see during negotiations, as well as how they've ramped up after President Trump took office.
Yeah, I think there are two messages. One would be to Trump, which is from the Russians, which is, you know what? We're winning. And just look at this. We can destroy them at the drop of a hat. Okay. Number two is a message I think the Kremlin is trying to send to Ukrainians themselves, which is, you know what? It's useless. We're going to win. Give up now, or it's going to be worse. And it's a pretty tough and pretty obnoxious message. But I think that psychological warfare is exactly what they're trying to do.